welcome to the 4th episode of the Sisyphus complex solution. For those few merry followers that I have, and that you'll notice that the beginning screen is a little bit different to how I normally like to conduct things. That's simply because on this occasion I want to concentrate quite heavily on the Sisyphus complex solution itself, and there are no videos that I've seen this week that I'd reasonably want to recommend, so I won't bother doing that. In the future, if I do come across things during the week, if I've got the time to watch other stuff and give some different perspectives and views of other people, I'll obviously return to that format. But for the time being, because there's quite a bit of complexity in terms of what I've been putting together to help show what the process is in going forward to develop the full mapped out system, there's a good chance that I might not even have time to do the fuck off to the World Economic Forum and the UN this week. I'll keep an eye on the time a little bit because, like I say, I think this one might be a little bit too complex to move into other areas, and this takes priority. So if you remember from last week, I showed a couple of pictures as to what the government looks like according to the transparency that they have on their on the government official websites, which is okay. You know, I mean, it's giving you at least some level of information. Now we're going to start narrowing down from the basis that we'd taken that core information, and as I demonstrated how I could cut that down to 40%, a reduction of 40%. So as you'll see here, and that this is the original set of agencies and departments and government listings as a whole, and yet where agencies in particular that are listed within this particular segment, all of these ones that are listed in green are actually replicated within the government departments already. So when you do make that transition and get rid of all of the replication, you end up with the second part. I'll move further up the page in a minute, and that is something I'm keeping separate for the moment. This was the second picture that I'd put up last week to show you how much of a reduction that physically looked like. So you've got less to be dealing with in terms of the investigations of digging into more detail, so you can start to really work more closely on that process, the considerations of government as a whole, what kind of proposals would be made for being able to run government efficiently and effectively, and obviously including the core ideas that people would want to see put in place, for which I mean, I did make a couple of policy suggestions at the end of episode 3. I've got a couple more this week. We need to start really ideally having this, whether it's a philosophy and ideology, I don't really care what it's going to be termed. It's just a matter of how we're going to be taking things forward so that it's got some overriding principles to it. And the overriding principle above all, and the one that is missing above all, is so that we can finally see something that is generating a proposition that has honesty at the heart of the final proposition. So, taking things step by step, I'm this week going to be looking at breaking down this first area. At the top of the hierarchy list, you obviously have the Prime Minister's office, and I will be looking at certain areas around that at a later stage, but I thought I'd just get us started with the Attorney General's office for the time being, where obviously, as you can see from the screen, hopefully the picture is coming out with reasonable quality this time. There are 4 agencies within it. Now, when it comes down to doing other agencies, I might not be able to have the time to go through every single one, having the most up-to-date information. So I might have to separate it over a couple of episodes. We'll see how it works out, because like everybody else, I do have a day job as well. So I've been running through some of the details of the Attorney General's office and those 4 agencies that are listed within it. And what I've decided to do here is to highlight the level of transparency for data that we can start to collate that are relevant to the number of employees and the total spend. Now, total spend, obviously we're talking about the staffing costs, administration, utilities, etc., etc., whatever costs are associated with that particular agency. And I'm not, at least within this particular sheet, I'm not breaking it down much further than that, because, like I said, those are areas that we start to look to later on when we come to develop even further policy suggestions. But there are certain parts that we need for the overview for the time being. So as you can see here, and that I've got the figures as best as I could find them. I do have links in the description for where I've resourced most of this data. Some of it has come from files where, when you do the search, it literally just presents you with an Excel sheet, so there's not really a link as such to put in there, but there's enough information anyway for you to be able to get an idea as to how it is that I'm conducting this kind of process, so that you can then look for yourself, see if because it's entirely possible that I've missed something. There might be some minor errors in there. You may find that, well, no, you will find for your own, if you're not in the UK running this process for yourself, obviously the level of information, the level of transparency that you can come across could be entirely different. But like I say, I'm just letting you know the process of how we actually get started with mapping things out. So we can see as a total for this particular department, you got the 788 million, which is quite substantial to say the least. There are some areas within this where it has been important to gain more detail than the standard employees and the total spend, the overall budget, basically, based on 2 factors. The first thing is that the timescales and certain areas of how they actually are funded, there are some slight anomalies within that. So what I've done here is, if you remember last week when I showed you the UK entire budget, the last budget that we had, I'd highlighted some numbers at the top. So taking these numbers and bringing it into the next file. So these are the numbers at the top and that I'd highlighted last week, where it had the 7-year period, the total expenditure and total receipts. So we've got something that we can start to use as a reference, and ideally be able to check to see, within the capabilities that we have of being able to get the right level of information, how accurate these assessments are. Now, the one thing that is particularly critical, so I'll bring things up a little bit further, are the dates of the information that has been available. So we just come down to that level for the time being. So you have, like I say, within the Attorney General's office itself, and that the earliest data I could come across was 2015, 2016. The number of employees is most definitely going to be wrong. I dare say the budget itself would be wrong. One of the key indicators to let us know roughly if we're in the right ballpark is going to be things like the average salary. That's why I've put that calculation in there as well. Any kind of indicator that makes us think, well, does that look realistic or not? So giving that kind of information as well, and that is going to help us understand a little bit further. But the key areas where further information was required has been around the government legal department and the Serious Fraud Office particularly. So for this particular sheet I'll concentrate on those two, and the reasons for those being particularly worthy of further investigation at the right time as going forward is that the government legal department has a process of not just being funded by government as such. Again, have a look for yourself. There's a certain method of them receiving funding and then giving money back, or receiving monies rather than just sort of direct funding. They're paid in return for advice, essentially. So in the same way as a legal firm would operate. I've got a different drink this week, by the way. Nice beer. Now, within the government legal department, there's something called the bona vacantia. Obviously, there's some Latin going to be thrown in there, and that because this is going to be something that goes back probably a good few hundred years. And what that is based on is this particular department having oversight and receiving revenue from the assets that are claimed from people who have deceased and where there are no known or identified relatives. So that means that the assets that were held under that particular individual after they've deceased, if there is nobody to claim those assets, it then gets taken into the ownership of the Crown. And this particular department is the recipient of that revenue. It's not quite as straightforward as literally just sort of, say for example, they've gained access to a house. Say, I don't know, Mrs. Jones has died, there's no relatives at all, the house is just sitting there. The first process that it goes through is that there's a list published. There is a known program in the UK called Air Hunters. Get the English right. Air Hunters, HEIR. And so basically they're the ones that go out and check to see if there are any relatives at all, so that they can claim a commission based on transferring those assets to those relatives. And the list is published reasonably often, and these organisations will obviously take a hold of that list when it's published. They will go off and do as much research as they possibly can to see if they can find somebody to hand those assets over to, whether that is in the form of the physical assets or more generally the monies raised from the sale of those assets. That tends to be more often the case, especially for people that didn't even know that the relative existed. But in the instances where such person cannot be found, then, as I say, it reverts to Crown ownership. And now you would imagine that, particularly if it's things like homes and I don't know, vehicles, higher value assets, you would imagine that these things are sold off and then the money go through to the Treasury. That would be a standard process as far as I'm concerned, but it goes towards paying for this particular department. Bit unusual. And with a little bit of digging into the department, you tend to find that they have revenues from the assets themselves. So the clearest indication is that if they've received a household, they're then renting those houses out, which from a government perspective, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't really see that it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you know, somebody's got to take ownership of the house and you can't just leave it. But whether it should be going through this particular department is a slightly dubious area. that especially when they always turn around and say that their department is cost neutral. Now, when you imagine the number of people that die every year, and it's sufficient that you have an entire industry called the air hunters going around trying to find relatives, it's more than enough people and more than enough instances taking place for this to be essentially a bit of a money spinner. So the amount of advice that they give to the government, equating to the value of revenue that they get via that process, that doesn't really strike me as plausible. So that's an area where taking things forward in terms of mapping things out and solutions, more transparency, things of this nature, because if you remember from the budget that I showed, none of this appears on that budget. So certainly worth looking into. The other part is within the Serious Fraud Office. Now, there might be some caveats to this. They do operate in a similar fashion again, whereby under instruction they will investigate any, particularly they're very strong on the corporate fraud and things of this nature, whereby when you look at the data that is presented within their reports, the earliest sort of annual figures that we can get is obviously in that, because we haven't finished this financial year, but the 2019-2020, this is obviously a very, very heavily funded department, not the biggest funding department, but it's still pretty big. Now, when they do have a successful case, and if you bother to look into the links and have a look at that department, and by all means it's worth looking in your own country as well, anybody outside the UK, to see how this works with your countries as well. When they win a case for which they don't actually undertake all that many, the specific report that I've seen in that, they've got it up in sort of big numbers and go, look at the number of cases that we've been involved with this year. And over the course of a year, if that is supposed to be representative of something that is impressive, then they've got very fucking low standards. But anyway, the key part that I was interested in is that they had made a great deal of the fact that they had won a couple of high profile cases, and that it resulted in fines of over 3 billion. Now, good, by all means, yes, like that. But then the net contribution to the Treasury that they've claimed for the same period is only 461 million. That doesn't sound accurate, especially when you look and see how that tallies with the budget. So again, some level of investigation there. The key part that I would hold back in terms of making any kind of unwarranted accusation is that when you are fining a company in the excess of, say, I don't know, 1.5 billion, it's not really a scenario whereby it's a case of, okay, judge puts down the hammer, right, 1.5 billion, there's the fine, and they just pay it before they walk out the door. That's not going to be the case. I dare say there's going to be an awful lot of it is deferred. There's going to be instalment payments. There's going to be a whole range of different scenarios around that, where it's not literally just because a sentence has been awarded or a fine has been awarded that they necessarily pay immediately. So it's worth keeping an eye on. It's worth looking at. Again, it's worth digging into that transparency, because that transparency is not there. And it's important because, again, from the revenue of the budget that was listed, it's not really clear that the amounts of these other activities that are actually going into the main budget. And if you don't keep track of things like that and to this type of value, then some people might remember the Theresa May, the magic money tree. Who knows? That could be the magic money tree. Depends on the number of cases that there are. But again, something for us to pay attention to. Now, with the large amounts that you're seeing on the screen there, particularly like with the CPS, with the 598 million, pretty big, we have to take into consideration what the percentage of that represents of the entire budget. And because it's less than 1%, you would expect a department that only has 4 agencies within it to be a fairly insignificant number. But what I will be doing as I'm going forward is breaking down how much this all starts to equate to, so that we can check to see how that measures against the budget that the government have put forward. So becomes these essentially become performance indicators. Yes, we will have the problem of timeframes not being what they should be, but it's still a sufficient performance indicator, and if they don't like the fact that those numbers are not quite as accurate as they should be, that's their fault for not putting the numbers up. So when you're running through a process like this, you need to be setting out a few separate sheets of information that are going to help you as you're moving forward, because trying to retain this level of information, because remember, we're talking about running an entire country, trying to retain this level of information on a couple of sheets, it's just not going to happen. And then making notes later, again, it's not going to work out. So one of the key areas that I want to look at here is in relation to these little snippets that I've come across over the transparency not being quite what it should be. So therefore I've moved into to start listing some policies. I will be putting this into a much more workable format and a much more, I suppose, aesthetically pleasing to a degree. I'll give you some indication of how those little advances take place, and that in a couple of the other sheets that I've started to put together as well. So from last week we had the 3 policies that I think that we could agree on. I've not heard anybody say no so far. Over the leaving the United Nations, listing the World Economic Forum as a national security threat, and the obvious problem also related to the United Nations, and that around the paedophiles. This should be common sense. But just on the information that we've gathered alone, we can also look towards make 2 new policies. The first one is the reporting commonality, where if you look yourself in that through the descriptions that I'll put in, you will notice that everything is done differently according to each different department. Otherwise you wouldn't end up with some having up-to-date information for the 2019-2020, others having only 2013. There isn't that commonality there, and so as I've put down in the rationale and the implications, if everybody has a standard format, because even if you're not operating on the same basis, so if you're getting levels of revenue that are coming in that other departments and other agencies don't have, it doesn't matter, it's just another listing within it. There should still be that common format so that people can see clearly exactly what's going on. That would greatly assist in the transparency of it, and it would greatly assist in the efficient running of government as a whole. If everybody is operating from the same hymn sheet, things are going to start to work more smoothly. Then we have the issue of what I think is something that's going to be important, not only within just this small level of evidence already, but going forward across an entire range of different departments. And that is where everything is based on empirical evidence, and I'm remembering this word to be able to pronounce it correctly, epistemology. So knowledge based. For each department to have the correct level of planning and the correct level of detail that's going to help you plan for the future. To understand what you're dealing with at the moment and be able to plan for the future, everything has to be knowledge based. Knowledge based means getting the right kind of data. Now, I know data is a particularly strange subject at the moment, and I will be giving a couple of examples as to how that's particularly important at the moment. There are a few. I'll move into one of the examples right now, actually. This is the prime reason why knowledge base is particularly important, because as we know, and as I've demonstrated from a previous episode, the UK National Statistics Authority is now within the hands of a government department, so direct responsibility. And as much as SAGE, that's the likes of this Ferguson idiot and literally bloody hundreds of others, but they relied predominantly on the work that this guy did. His models are not based on knowledge at all. It's not based on anything that's remotely logical. The coding that he used to be able to put together the algorithm to make the predictions was, as the fella said, when they look at it, it was a joke. So this is why this level of detail is particularly important. So let's go back to this one. There is one more example that I'll go to in a minute. So when we're looking at having, I'll explain this figure shortly. When we've got a logic-based system and something that everybody can understand, we can then not only have that transparency and the information that we're hoping for from our governments, which anybody that cares to then look into it and to hold people to account for, it's going to be much easier to present, much easier to track, much easier to identify any flaws and to develop the appropriate response to that. It will have a knock-on effect across a range of different areas. So the key part that I want people to think about, and that in terms of this being an important policy to put forth now, it will play a key role within the education sector later on as well. Now, as much as we have things like the humanities to drive everybody up the wall with the 2 + 2 = 5 nonsense at the moment, there is a particular picture that I've actually forgotten to get ready, which is typical, but there you go. So I'll bring it up now. Right, I should have prepared that much better, but never mind. And you got to see my file, so yeah. These particular areas of true science, true evidence, are centred around a lot of the conversations that you hear that are based on climate change. Again, possibly be more information discussed around this at a later date. But the reason why epistemology is so important, and understanding what that scientific method is, what it's for, to be able to drive decision making ideally, as well as obviously learning and knowledge in general. I would suggest that if you made a note of these two questions and these two key factors, because if you can't achieve the scientific method, your fallback position is the precautionary principle, and that is the world where people do rely on models. Within the climate conversation, I have never seen anybody else ask for these two critical areas of burden of proof. It just doesn't happen. People will say, "Oh, I've got a hypothesis. I've got this particular piece of data. I've got that particular piece of data." It doesn't meet the criteria for burden of proof, and without that, there really should be no level of action taken by governments that are not very, very well planned beforehand. I mean, I would imagine everybody's of the same opinion. So, of course you want the environment to be as good as it possibly can be within reason, because again, other parts that people don't tend to take into consideration. The opposite end of clean is, you're looking at sterile. The more sterility it is, the more your immune system is going to be a problem. So there's areas of consideration that are not taken into account, and levels of direct responsibility for burden of proof that are not taken into account. So if we have this scenario that is predominantly pushed by the IPCC, a member of the United Nations, and whereby I know there are certain people that are saying at the moment that, well, the IPCC doesn't actually say a lot of the things that the alarmists say. It's not true. You only have to look at their documentation on advice to decision makers. The alarmism comes directly from those documents. So when it comes down to epistemology, understanding this type of thing, what the level of evidence is required, the level of knowledge, the level of data, etc., etc., there's a reason why this becomes quite important. So when we come back to the policies, this particular figure here, this is not a final figure by any stretch of the imagination. Again, there's a link in the description and that you can calculate this yourself. This is predominantly around the changes of government investment into reacting to this climate yet to be proven problem, and it's predominantly around things like the automotive sector. Now, up to 2050, and an awful lot of this is actually going to be allocated up to 2030, but there's one final number within it that takes it up to 2050. So we could be looking towards a cost saving of $3.5 billion, just purely by asking for empirical evidence and standard scientific method, and understanding what the base process of how you develop algorithms for models is achieved. We start asking the right levels of questions. We start putting a halt to all this, my decisions are based on my feelings. No, it's not. That's not how things work. We need to understand this type of stuff. I mean, it does also move into begging the question around the extent of data. That is something that I'll start to be adding in as we move forward with the model as well, with this particular model, which is fact-based. And we're going to have to take into consideration a lot of the a lot of the movements, a lot of the suggestions, and an awful lot of the exaggeration as well over things like this Industry 4.0. A lot of people are calling it the fourth industrial revolution. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. A lot of the technologies are not as advanced as people make out, but within that we have to understand what level of data is acceptable data. There is or there should be a clear difference between privacy and beneficial data. That's something that will start to move in a little bit later on, but again, something for us to be taken into consideration. On to the next page, we've got the lessons learned. This one should be pretty standard, and there's going to be a whole bunch of lefties that will want to scream and shout at this particular point in time. There is one key problem that needs to be front and centre as we're moving forward. Like I say, from the model and the economic levers that can be pulled and things of this nature, all of these types of areas and that will be put in there. So for example, like the trickle-down economy and things of this nature, we'll end up making some level of listing as to the effectiveness of that. But primarily, there has to be the agreement that above all, failed ideologies always get rejected for the reasons listed. As we know that an awful lot of this failed ideologies of socialism and so forth are being fed through universities at the moment. Part of the attack there will be having the empirical and epistemological even systems implemented and obligated within universities should start to see an end to a lot of this nonsense, because everything these people come up with is there's no facts involved. And I think it was Ben Shapiro that came up with the expression, facts don't care about your feelings. Once you remove all of that nonsense, you should end up getting rid of these types of ideologies, which nobody should be implementing, considering, or anything like that at a future date. And the reason why you would keep this register of lessons learned is that as you are going forward, if you do happen to make any cock-ups, if you do happen to think, well, okay, we've got this particular process of gathering data that we think will be effective and will result in greater transparency and greater confidence for the general public, but then you find that there's a loophole in there that somebody can take advantage of, and it can be something that is used for performing certain levels of corruption, for example, which is always going to be one of the prime areas where you're going to be looking towards shutting down any loopholes and any problems of that nature, because that is fundamentally one of the key solutions that we're looking to provide here, is to remove these levels of corruption and how people take advantage of systems, and particularly hide behind systems. So we'll be able to start listing these things in there, so that at a later date we say, right, we're looking again at how our data is being put together, how our decision making is being considered, what kind of secondary thinking is involved, is there anything that we need to be cautious of. We can start to have this listed in the right fashion so that people can just refer back to it and say, right, this is the method that we're considering at the moment. Is there anything within that system that we've not taken into account that we can refer back to and go, okay, that was a problem at that point, we need to take consideration of that moving forward so that we can remove those problems. This is the lessons learned register is something that I think is, in this particular type of instance, and that incredibly important, because you hear the term lessons learned from coming out of politicians' mouths all of the time. Every time they say it, you know they haven't learned a damn thing. So it's reclaiming terminology to actually serve a purpose. So that's the part around the lessons learned register. So as I say, we'll start moving forward with that. The risk register, so it's slightly more attractive in appearance. Obviously I've spent a little bit more time on just the attractiveness and less on the actual detail, because there's a few things that I need to put in the Attorney General's office risk register as well. So we have things like the I've decided to just sort of put some general considerations, just a couple to begin with. Like I said, I don't want to start running ahead of myself without other people providing some input and consideration, because this is not, like I say, this isn't Paulism. This is about other people being able to say, well, right, we understand that there's an issue here we might need to be aware of. So we've got the ONS data. This is largely because of the existing issues, as I showed you before, and that's around the current problem around COVID and whatever, and that where the data being collected is not being done in a standard fashion. They say it is one of those areas, and that it probably will end up being a lessons learned entry, because they seem to have just completely forgotten all standard practice. So this is a department now that, especially that it's within a government department, it's one of the agencies directly listed under the control of a government minister. There needs to be much more consideration over this, because there is the expression of lies, damned lies and statistics. Having a department that is supposed to be providing us with the information that is to help us planning going forward, this has got to be squeaky clean. So we need to be paying particular attention to that. And there is another example as to why. And I'll bring this one up, the second page. Now, this is from 2018. Making reference, because obviously I don't think I'll have time to do the United Nations stuff in this episode, but I will refer to the United Nations as far as the ONS is concerned, because they're the ones that are going to be responsible for the implementation of Agenda 2030. So all those people out there that say, oh, Agenda 2030 doesn't exist, it's a conspiracy theory. This is from the, again, I'm pretty sure I will be having the link in the description. This is from the ONS's website, that the ONS in the UK has been awarded the contract to run the statistics for Agenda 2030. This places the UK as a prime player in Agenda 2030 itself, but more recently the Great Reset, which I've mentioned on a number of occasions now. Having one of our employees, our department's employees, involved in something like this, and I doubt that this has been made. I've never seen anybody mention this in the media before, that the ONS was awarded performing this kind of activity, funded by us. This makes this department very, very important in terms of how we view it going forward. The prime problems that we have at the moment is the fact that they do have inaccurate and out-of-date information. So this is taking things back to a more practical perspective. So we can expand on the risk, the external influences. So basics of the pure future planning. The data resources, again, that's down to a larger discussion around, like I say, the privacy and things of this nature. So these types of areas and that will need to be expanded on quite considerably. Yeah, so that's basically, yeah, that's what that one says there. And because that department, the UK Statistics Authority, would be the risk owner, then you place the axe above their head. Simple as that. The second part around the public sector exceeding 20%. This is a little bit more detail that I'm going to need to go into in this particular folder, which is the state of the labour market. This is reasonably recent, coming up to March of this year. So obviously in that there's going to be a great deal of shift moving into the second and third quarters. But seeing as the next one is not due until, I think oh no, I've got rid of it. The next one is due, I think, in September. So there will be some updates to be performed. But the problem that I've got here is that as much as it's good to have these sectoral breakdowns, which I've got a graph down below to demonstrate that further, I'm concerned about this. The 21.86% of the workforce in the UK works for the government on some level, whether that's central government or local government. That's a level that comes with risks, which I will go back to in a moment. Listed within the risk register. These are just some basic details that explain these figures. But what I wanted to do with this is take a look at the numbers that we have in terms of what that represents in terms of numbers of people. So as much as the last census was done in 2011, it's still not unreasonable to assume these age groups and the percentage cannot be applied to the current population, which is this figure here, the 67,922,000 blah blah. So essentially we're looking at a workforce potential of 44 million people in the UK that are within this 15 to 64 age range. Obviously it means a couple of little adjustments that are required. So we take out all of those people that are employed at the moment, and this is why we end up with this figure here. 15-year-olds are not employed, but because this figure doesn't have each particular age number included, it's an assumption to make that over these 49 years we just divide it out there and take the 15-year-olds out of the equation, and then we need to take out the current unemployment rate as of March, which was 4%, just below 4%. So these are unemployed people. Then we need to take out those that are in higher education, which leaves us with not far off 8 million people that are essentially unaccounted for. These types of areas need to be taken into consideration as you're moving forward because of planning and things of this nature. I have got the note in there, and that's to say that yes, there are going to be stay-at-home parents. There's also a little cheeky note that it will also include a whole bunch of millennials that are living in their mum's basement. So this figure doesn't necessarily mean that there are people completely off the grid, but it's a number that we'd need to be relatively aware of. And then the final numbers down here, the TFR, total fertility rate. In order for the population to be maintained as it is, if there was nobody else coming in, nobody else going out. For that number to be maintained, the fertility rate would have to be 1.65 children. I know it's a silly way of doing it, and that because you can't get 6.65 of a child, but yeah, stats. That falls below the required rate to maintain that population of 2.1. So essentially, why this is important is you want to be taking a look at how this overall population number would be affected for future planning, because if there's going to be any reduction in the number of people that are employed, that means that you're going to have less of a revenue stream. If there's people that the younger population is reduced and the elderly is increased, you've got a higher pension burden, less of a revenue pool to provide for that pension. So that's why this type of thing is important. Slight issue with that is that we also have this, which the closest number, and that is going to be the 66 million that was estimated from 2018. Again, this is ONS data. The full extent of the numbers here, and that is based on where everybody comes from within the UK. There is a website doing the rounds that I debunked to a degree. I can't remember how long ago, maybe about a month or so ago, that said that the population of the UK was going to be reduced to 1/3 of its current levels by 2025. There was a similar sort of scenario that was being suggested to us in terms of the population of the US as well. It was a nonsense website, and even from the ONS themselves, so you've got the 2028 projections, 69 million. So not going down, but increasing. But remember that TFR number. That means more immigration, 69 million. They take it through to 2038, 72 million. So, because we're at 67 million at the moment, that potentially means that they're looking at, have they chucked in that 3 million from Hong Kong that they suggested? Who knows? But it seems something that we need to be taking consideration of, that the TFR rate is not at the same level that it would need to be for replication, and yet the numbers are increasing. So it's just a little snippet of information for us to be keeping an eye on, again, as we're progressing forward. If populations are going to be increased, that has an effect on policies. Now, in terms of the different sectors, remember, rather than having people, rather than me looking through and that just going based on figures, I thought, there you go, nice little pretty picture for you. Most people like pretty pictures, so, except for my ugly mug, of course, is covering half of it. But key parts to understand, I'll bring that one up actually so you can see the more important part now. Because obviously the larger towers and that's just all employees, private and public breakdown, and then the rest. This is something that we wanted to be taking a good note of, really, because when it comes down to areas where we might be looking to reduce size of government and then putting people into the private sector, which are the areas of the private sector that seem most likely for growth potential, revenue potential, skills requirements, a whole range of different things. So we can start to have some of the core details. Basically, we're looking towards putting together some core details so that we've got something to base our understanding on as to how we start planning going forward. So how that relates to the risk register. I say it's exceeded 20%. I've always had it in the back of my mind, and I can't remember for the life of me as to where I first heard this and where I first learned of this particular problem. But it was always assumed within the corporate sector that if your wages were going to be in excess of 20% of your operational expense, that starts to become a problem. It becomes a problem for a whole range of reasons, but within a corporate atmosphere and a public atmosphere, there's going to be some variations to it. But I needed to be able to flag this one up as something that we need to be taking into consideration. Now, why would we end up with a larger workforce within the public sector? And it strikes me that the obvious reason at the moment, because of all the different policies that are coming out, and as I've pointed out before, and at the sheer size of the UK government, it's just pure overreach. They are taking levels of responsibility, and the general public are becoming less and less responsible for themselves as a result of it. Never a good thing. That is literally shifting into a failure to understand the lessons learned. It is falling into that socialism trap. It's overreach. They're impeding on people's lives in levels that they really should not be. So that's, to me, that's the root cause of how it presents that kind of problem. Interesting again for people anybody outside of the UK, take a look and see how things are working in your countries, because again, when you're looking at people arguing about whether you live in a capitalist system or not, and capitalism is the biggest problem in the world, if you've got this size of government, you're not operating in a capitalist system. So it's laying blame where it really doesn't belong. It's laying blame where it should be pointed towards things like cronyism and corruption at a governmental level. That's where the problems come in. So it's understanding where the real causes of problems come from. Then you can present a solution. Right, so the key impact and the key reasons is and there is more than this, but again, I just wanted to give an indication. The problems that you have, as I have mentioned, in terms of the issues around the population, so for example, getting fewer younger people and more older people. If you've got an oversized government, you end up with a very similar problem, because the revenue that you're getting coming in from a smaller pool of income tax and corporate tax and all of this sort of stuff, the people actually generate the real money. The less of the size of that pool becomes, the harder it becomes to pay for this great bloated workforce, which means you're going to be subject to something called the law of diminishing returns. The receipts that you gain from those people working in the private sector are going to start reducing. So you can't keep growing government unless you want to, as you'll see from last week's quote from Maggie Thatcher, it's great when you're relying on other people's money. You start to run out of other people's money in this scenario. It does have a problem around wage inflation, because public sector employees are notorious for being paid more than private. I know that there's an awful lot of people that claim they're claiming the opposite. It's not true. Simple as that. It's just not true. The public sector, when you combine all of the wages, the pension, the benefits and so forth, particularly in the UK, it far outstrips the private sector by a pretty wide margin. So what that's going to then do is it's going to mean that the cost of production in the private sector is going to get higher, which makes you less competitive. So there's knock-on effects, there's impact to the wider economy on that basis. The crowding out scenario, that is literally a case of, if you are working within the public sector and you've noticed that you've basically become untouchable because, you know, how many people get held to account in the public sector? Not bloody many. And even when they do, and that, they seem to still get a massive payout. That means that people that are thinking, well, in terms of my long-term future, how much of a risk do I want to take? Am I going to be getting the most benefit over the long term working for the public sector or working within the private sector? Generally speaking, that you will tend to find that the best tend to look towards the private sector, because as much as there is the risk there of changing jobs, getting sacked, being subject to the open market and things of this nature, the more ability that you gain, the higher up the ladder you can get, doesn't necessarily stand with the public sector. So whilst you might go through a period of time where you're not earning as much as you would in the public sector, the long-term vision is that you will. Those people that have got a little less ambition, that just want to float through life, they'll head over to the public sector, and that becomes a case of crowding out, because as much as they may want to just sort of float through life to begin with, doesn't mean to say that they're not people that could be contributing to a firm in the private sector. They could have, with the right level of instigation towards a more ambitious perspective, they could provide a great deal of added productivity, which again would then feed back into the public. So the crowding out side of things is that it takes people out of the talent pool for the private sector. Obviously there are occasions you'll come across certain people like that you wouldn't wish them on either side, you wouldn't wish them on your worst enemy, but they generally tend to end up in the public sector. It's just a fact. So the actions that are required to resolve that, there does need to be that level of redistribution. As much as again, people will not like the term of austerity. It's not really austerity as such, and I'm amazed it hasn't taken place already. But the government size needs to be reduced. Like I say, when we're breaking through these different departments, hopefully people will get to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that we're targeting all the wrong things. We're making government as efficient and as accountable as it possibly can be, and it's sorting the wheat from the chaff, getting rid of the areas that we don't need, so we can bring that percentage down. From my personal perspective, maximum in that, it should be something that shouldn't really go above 15%. I mean, the 20% is the danger sign. 15% would be max. I wouldn't, from my perspective, again, open to discussion. But so then we'd be looking to understand, you're taking 6% of the workforce. Are they going to be distributed out into the private sector effectively and not just left on the pile? So policies will need to be implemented around that, considerations around that. Yeah, and there's one of the key risks. If you don't have those policies performed correctly, if you don't have the right level of enhanced policies for the private sector to encourage growth, you end up with just a burden on the welfare state. I alluded to it as well in terms of this is all purely just giving indications. The secondary consideration is that the larger the size of government, the larger the size of the public sector workforce, the higher the pensions liability becomes. I have mentioned offline, on LinkedIn rather, on a number of occasions, to say that the pensions pot is one that is it's something that would certainly explain why so many pensioners are being targeted at the moment by certain governors and individuals, and that to be removed from the equation, because the pension pot is a bubble that will burst on account of being a 7% return requirement in a 2% market, i.e. it cannot generate the revenue from investments to be able to meet the pension obligations. That's a problem. That really is a problem. And increasing the size of government or keeping the size of government at an unsustainable level is going to make that worse. The people that do work in the the public sector, depending on the type of role that they're playing. I mean, so this isn't a blasé sort of across the board type of comment, but some people will be paying in addition an additional amount to get a better pension later on. Other people, like high-level civil servants and MPs in particular, they are on massive pensions, and so areas around that need to be considered. But the overall wider perspective as to the numbers where that liability is held, this is where we need to be taking it into consideration as well. I would place that risk burden on these three departments. BEIS is the Department for Business Education, Industry and, where are they? No, not education. Department for Business, Energy, Industry or Strategy. Sorry, because they changed it, because education used to be in there. But anyway, it's in there for obvious reasons. It's part of the conversation because they have to be involved in the redistribution programs. Treasury is going to have a direct impact on them. Work and pensions, because the pensions liability, and making sure we do not have that welfare problem. So we start to develop out the model in a little bit more detail. The area that the final page that I have, again, it's just a start point. People that are involved with project management will be aware of this. It's called a RASIC, and the RASIC, as you can see up the top there, that's what it stands for. Responsible Approver, Support, Informed and Consulted. It's literally turning around and saying, well, okay, as you started to move forward with investigating these areas correctly, having the policies in mind, but how it's actually going to be implemented from a practical perspective, what other considerations need to be taken into account. You start to list out all the people that would start to become involved in those areas. I'll just put my name in there, and that's, again, indication. It's not going to be Paulism. So what you do is, and this is just the first part, you have your key project management team. They will list out who the individuals are, what their role of responsibility is. Some of you who are involved in project management will say, well, that's actually not project management, that's program management. Couldn't give a shit. It all ends up being the same thing. I've started to list a couple of areas. Again, things will start to expand as we go forward. Underneath the Attorney General's office, what we will end up with once I've gone through all of the different departments, you'll see the list coming down with the main department as the head, and then those agencies that are not held directly under the management of the Cabinet Office Minister, then that will be listed as an individual. But I wanted to start off just by giving an indication as to how things progress. there's a couple of little areas that are in there that I've already pretty much covered. But again, so that when you're starting to develop an entire, use the term program, I don't mind, use the term program and that for how you want government to be structured as a whole going forward. In the event that all 18 subscribers, we've decided that we're going to take over our respective countries, how would we actually start day one? What do you do to government? How do you actually make sure that it's running without interruption? That you're not going to end up with the reason why I started this in the first place, of people that turn around and say, okay, I've got this single issue. I don't want us to be, so, as an example, I don't want us to be having any more immigration. Great. Then what? You still think that everything runs wonderfully? And you end up with these departments that then have got a contract with the United Nations to do their data programs and things of this nature? No. You need to understand from day one, this is what government looks like, this is what we've been looking to do, and you stick with it. You will end up in scenarios where, and it seems to be a common argument at the moment, and that's in the UK with this Dominic Cummings, who said that he wants to do some alterations within the civil service. That is an entirely correct thing to do. You would need to have any party, any national agreement with the general public to say, for this particular role, I know that this civil servant does not have the right mindset, does not have the right skill set. He needs to step back. Here's somebody that can fulfill that role. And you should ideally start to map out who it is that you want in those positions. So we start to build out, put a bit of flesh on the bones of the model. So I wanted to concentrate this episode on giving that little bit more detail and give you an understanding as to what kind of proposition it is that I'm putting forward, as to how we all start to think a little bit more around politics, so that we're not led by the nose off to the climate issue and the COVID issue and the other issue, and anything to just turn your head away from what it is that they're actually doing. Because as we will determine more and more, there are areas of knowledge, data discussion that it would be much better if people in general had a wider understanding of what happens within your own country, who's actually making these decisions, who are you having contracts with, where's the money going, where's the money coming from, etc., etc. So I think I will leave the United Nations and World Economic Forum segment today, because I've probably gone on for far too long already. If you've got any feedback, if there's other areas in that way you think, okay, because again, this is not the full model, this is giving an idea as to the steps that I take at this stage, so that the things that we do find out from the data, we can start to lay out in a formal proposition, something so that we can refer to the data when we need to, things that we need to understand going forward, refer back to as well, to go, okay, well, this particular department is working with that department, how much money is shifting, what's the relationship between them, all of this type of thing, before we can then start developing the fundamentals of what would eventually be the replication of the Hoskyn's government wiring map. So, as I say, any feedback, any suggestions, any thoughts, any particular aspects that you find out for yourself, where you think looking at a little bit more detail than perhaps, where is it? There we go. Well, let's put it through this one. I mean, I think as a start point, this level of information is good enough to get us going. And like I say, when there are those specific anomalies that do need to be highlighted, I do bring them forward. But the base data, making sure that the numbers start to match with the budgets that we're always presented with. Let's make sure that these things start to add up, because one of the key areas of response to government at any particular point in time would be to say, where did that money go? How are we able to finance certain things, passing additional burdens of debt onto future generations, whilst this particular black hole exists here? If indeed it does, this is what we'll start to find out. So I will be ending with the standard Moirai directory. There are no additions as yet. It's, like I say, it's open to any particular company that would like to have their details listed, provided that you don't start pandering to any particular agenda. Just concentrate on what it is that you do to the best of your efforts, then more than happy to include it. Okay, so hopefully this, I mean, from my perspective, there's plenty of detail here and that for you to be giving some considerations and some thoughts to, some ideas as to how you would do things as well, and to turn it from an idea that is coming from me to an idea that becomes available to all, and for all to provide some input. Okay, so I'm gonna get on with my beer and call an end to this week's episode. Okay, so thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.